Emma Caldwell's breath frosted in the bitter January air as she trudged along the narrow path that led from Widow's Creek to her small homestead. The two wooden buckets hung heavy from the yoke across her shoulders, water sloshing against the sides with each careful step she took across the frozen ground. At 32, her face was etched with lines that spoke of hardship rather than age, her once soft hands now calloused and red from constant work. 3 winters had passed since influenza had taken her husband James, leaving her alone with 40 acres of stubborn Texas soil and a small cabin that leaked when the spring rains came. The town of Thornfield lay 15 miles east, close enough to sell her occasional surplus, but far enough that most travelers avoided her isolated homestead, especially in winter. Just a little farther, she murmured to herself, adjusting the wooden yoke that dug into her shoulder blades. The creek that ran near her cabin had frozen solid during the latest cold snap, forcing her to make the half-mile journey to Widow's Creek twice daily. It was named for her now, though few remembered the 3 other widows who'd tried to make it alone on this unforgiving land before her. None had lasted more than a season. Emma had lasted 3 years, and she'd sworn on James's grave that she would not abandon what they had built together. But lately, doubt crept in with the winter chill. The previous summer's drought had left her with barely enough stored to make it to spring. The single cow she owned had gone dry earlier than expected, and her small flock of chickens produced fewer eggs in the cold. What Emma didn't know, couldn't know, was that she wasn't alone on the trail that afternoon. Dakota had been watching the white woman for 4 days now. The 28-year-old Comanche warrior remained perfectly still among the bare branches of the winter forest, his dark eyes following her labored progress along the path. His people called him Silent One, not merely for his reserved nature, but for his legendary ability to move through forests and plains without disturbing so much as a blade of grass. He had earned his place among the most respected warriors of his band before his 25th summer. But Dakota no longer rode with his people. The massacre at Yellow River 2 years prior had taken his wife, his infant son, and his younger brother. He alone had survived the cavalry attack, pulling an army blade from his side and crawling 5 miles to warn the main camp. By the time he recovered from his wounds, bitterness had settled deep in his soul. He could not bring himself to join the raids his cousins led against white settlements, but neither could he embrace the reservation life that some bands had accepted. So he had become a ghost, drifting between worlds, belonging to neither. 4 nights earlier, he had been tracking a wounded deer when he first spotted the white woman's cabin. Curiosity more than anything had kept him nearby. White women did not typically live alone on the frontier. He had expected to see a husband, perhaps children, but day after day she emerged alone, feeding chickens, chopping firewood, and now carrying water through the bitter cold. Dakota shifted silently among the trees, moving parallel to her path. Her determination puzzled him. Most white settlers he'd encountered traveled in groups, armed and suspicious. This woman carried no weapons save a small knife at her belt, and she struggled visibly under the weight of the water buckets. Yet something in her steady pace reminded him of the women of his tribe, the quiet strength that endured, while men fought and died. Emma paused at the crest of a small rise, setting her buckets down to adjust her woolen scarf. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the frozen landscape. She needed to reach home before dark. The wolves had been growing bolder as winter deepened. "Just get through till spring," she told herself, her voice barely audible over the wind that had begun to pick up. She lifted the yoke again, wincing as it settled against already bruised skin, and continued her journey. From his vantage point, Dakota noticed what Emma did not: dark clouds gathering in the north, moving faster than she could walk. A blue norther was rolling in, one of the deadly winter storms that could send temperatures plummeting within hours. He had prepared a sheltered camp in a small cave not far from the creek, but the woman would never reach her cabin before the storm hit. For the first time in days, indecision gripped him. His people and hers were enemies. The cavalry that had slaughtered his family had ridden from a fort not 50 miles from here. Every instinct told him to retreat to his shelter and let fate decide her future. But as he watched her steady, determined steps, something long dormant stirred within him. Before he had been a warrior, he had been a protector. His people did not turn their backs on courage, even in an enemy. Emma felt the first bite of the changing wind and quickened her pace. The path ahead dipped into a small ravine before rising again toward her cabin, which was still out of sight beyond the next ridge. She'd made this journey hundreds of times, but never so late in the day, and never with a storm approaching. Fear began to thread through her determination. Her foot caught on a frozen root and she stumbled, losing her balance. The wooden yoke shifted and one bucket tipped, spilling precious water onto the frozen ground. Emma let out a cry of frustration that was swallowed by the rising wind. "No, no, no," she muttered, struggling to right the bucket while keeping the other from spilling too. She'd have to return to the creek, adding precious time to her journey as darkness and storm approached. Takoda watched her struggle, the internal battle within him reaching its conclusion. He would not interfere with her life, but neither would he watch her die when he could prevent it. The storm coming would kill her as surely as any arrow. Moving silently down from his position, he began to close the distance between them. Emma had just managed to secure the yoke again when she felt it, the prickling awareness of being watched. She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found herself staring into the dark, expressionless eyes of a Comanche warrior standing not 20 paces away. Her fingers instinctively went to the small knife at her belt, though she knew it would offer little protection. Stories of Comanche raids had reached even her isolated homestead, tales of brutality that made settlers barricade their doors at night. But the warrior made no move toward her. He simply stood, his face impassive, a worn army blanket wrapped around his shoulders against the cold. Behind him, the storm clouds loomed closer, and the first snowflakes began to swirl in the strengthening wind. The wind howled outside the small cave, driving snow into drifts that grew higher with each passing hour. Inside, Emma sat as far from Takoda as the confined space would allow, her back pressed against the cold stone wall. A small fire flickered between them, casting long shadows across their faces. Neither had spoken since he had led her here, just as the full fury of the storm descended. Emma's fear had not subsided, but it had been joined by reluctant gratitude. She understood enough about Blue Northers to know she would have died trying to reach her cabin. The Comanche had saved her life by bringing her to this shelter, a fact that conflicted with everything she'd been told about his people. Takoda fed another small branch into the fire, his movements deliberate and efficient. He had prepared well for the storm, gathering enough wood to last through the night and laying out dry grasses for bedding. Now he sat cross-legged, his rifle within reach but not in his hands, a detail Emma had not missed. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. She wasn't sure if he understood English, but she needed to break the tense silence. Takoda's dark eyes flickered to her face, then back to the fire. After a long moment, he nodded once. "You speak English?" Emma ventured. "Some," he replied, his voice deeper than she expected, the word heavily accented but clear. Relief washed through her. At least they could communicate, however basically. "I'm Emma. Emma Caldwell." Takoda considered this, then touched his chest. "Takoda." An awkward silence fell between them again. Emma pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, worry creeping back into her thoughts. "My animals," she began, then stopped. How could she explain her concern for a cow and chickens to this man who had likely lost far more? But Takoda seemed to understand. "Storm pass by morning, animals wait." "You've been watching me," Emma said suddenly, the realization crystallizing. "For how long?" Takoda held up 4 fingers. 4 days. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Why?" He considered her question, searching for the right words in a language not his own. Curious. Woman alone. Not common. Emma couldn't argue with that assessment. Even in Thornfield, her determination to maintain the homestead alone had drawn disapproval and pity in equal measure. The banker visited twice yearly to suggest she sell the land. The preacher came occasionally to hint at suitable widowers in the county. "My husband died," she explained, unsure why she felt compelled to share this with a stranger, a Comanche warrior no less. "This land was our dream. I couldn't leave it." Something flickered in Takoda's eyes, recognition perhaps. He touched his chest again. "Wife, son, brother." He made a sweeping motion with his hand. "Gone." The simple gesture conveyed more loss than words could have expressed. Emma felt an unexpected pang of empathy. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Takoda nodded, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting further discussion. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew a strip of dried meat, offering it to her across the fire. Emma hesitated only briefly before accepting it. Her stomach had been growling for hours, and pride seemed a foolish luxury in their current situation. The jerky was tough but flavorful, spiced with something unfamiliar. "Thank you," she said again, the words coming easier this time. As they ate in silence, Emma studied her unlikely companion more carefully. His face bore the weathered lines of someone who lived outdoors, but she guessed him to be close to her own age. A long scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and his hands showed the calluses of a life of physical labor not unlike her own. The blanket he wore had clearly once belonged to the U.S. Cavalry, its blue edge visible despite the dirt and wear. The irony wasn't lost on her. A Comanche warrior using an army blanket to survive, just as she, a white settler, now depended on this Comanche for her survival. Outside, the storm raged on, but the small fire kept the worst of the cold at bay. Emma's eyelids grew heavy as exhaustion began to overcome fear and discomfort. She fought against sleep, uncertain whether it was safe to lower her guard. Dakota noticed her struggle. "Sleep," he said simply. "I watch." Emma wanted to protest, to insist she would stay awake, but her body betrayed her. Her head nodded forward once, twice. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Dakota, silhouetted against the fire, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance where snow continued to fall in a thick white curtain. When Emma awoke, pale morning light filtered through the cave entrance. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She sat up quickly, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was, and with whom, but Dakota was gone. Emma scrambled to her feet, her muscles protesting after hours on the hard ground. The fire had burned down to embers, but the cave retained some of its warmth. Her water buckets stood near the entrance, both now full. He must have filled them at some point while she slept. Moving to the cave opening, Emma gasped at the transformed landscape. At least 2 feet of snow covered everything in sight, pristine and untouched, save for a single set of footprints leading away from the cave. In the distance, she could just make out the smoke rising from what must be her cabin's chimney. He had gone ahead to check on her homestead, perhaps even to light a fire so she would return to warmth. The realization left her speechless. Emma gathered her belongings and the water buckets, now manageable with the wooden yoke Dakota had apparently carried along with them. She stepped carefully into his footprints, following the path he had broken through the deep snow. As she crested the final ridge, her cabin came into view. Smoke indeed rose from the chimney, and she could see that a path had been cleared to the chicken coop and the small barn where her cow was kept. Of Dakota himself, there was no sign. Emma pushed open her cabin door to find a fire blazing in the hearth. On her rough-hewn table lay 3 rabbits, already dressed and ready for cooking. Beside them, a small leather pouch containing what looked like dried berries and roots. Food to see her through until the snow melted enough for hunting or traveling to town. Emma sank into her single chair, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Outside her window, the vast white landscape gave no hint of her benefactor's whereabouts. He had vanished as silently as he had appeared in her life. But something told her this would not be their last encounter. February brought a temporary thaw, turning the pristine snow into muddy slush that made every chore on Emma's homestead twice as difficult. She had not seen Dakota since the morning after the storm, though sometimes she felt eyes watching her from the tree line. Rather than fear, the sensation now brought a strange comfort, like having a guardian angel of flesh and blood instead of wings and halo. The rabbits he had left had lasted nearly a week, supplemented by the dried foods in the pouch. When those ran out, Emma had been surprised to find fresh tracks leading to her door one morning and a wild turkey hanging from her porch post. No footprints led away, as if the provider had simply vanished into thin air. On this particular morning, Emma was attempting to repair a section of her chicken coop that had collapsed under the weight of the snow. The hens clucked irritably around her feet as she struggled with a stubborn board, her hammer slipping repeatedly in the mud. "Damnation," she muttered, as the hammer glanced off the nail for the 3rd time, narrowly missing her thumb. The unladylike curse would have scandalized the women of Thornfield, but out here, with only chickens for company, Emma had long since abandoned such pretenses. "Need help?" The quiet voice behind her nearly caused Emma to drop the hammer entirely. She whirled around to find Dakota standing a few paces away, observing her struggle with an expression that might have contained a hint of amusement, though it was difficult to tell. "You startled me," she said. her free hand pressed against her hammering heart. "Do you always move so quietly?" Dakota shrugged slightly. "Habit." He gestured toward the sagging coupe. "Bad design. Snow too heavy." Emma bristled slightly at the criticism of James's handiwork, then sighed. "You're right. James built it for Texas heat, not winter storms." Dakota moved closer, taking the hammer from her with a questioning look. When she nodded, he examined the structure with a critical eye. "Need support here," he said, pointing to the corner post. "And here. Roof angle wrong." "Can you fix it?" Emma asked, then hastily added, "I can pay you with eggs or maybe a chicken. I don't have much else to offer." Dakota shook his head. "No payment." He hesitated, then added, "Need work, something to do." Emma understood then, the restlessness that came from grief, the need to keep hands busy when the mind wanted to dwell on what was lost. She had thrown herself into maintaining the homestead for the same reason after James died. "All right," she agreed, "but you'll at least share a meal when you're done." Dakota nodded and set to work immediately, dismantling the damaged sections of the coop with efficient movements. Emma watched for a moment, then returned to her own chores, feeding the animals and checking her dwindling supplies. By midday, the chicken coop had been completely transformed. Dakota had reinforced the corner posts, angled the roof to shed snow more effectively, and even added a small covered run where the chickens could scratch without being exposed to predators. He worked with a precision that spoke of years of practical experience, using materials scavenged from around her property. Emma brought water from her recently thawed well and watched as he completed the final touches. "You're good with your hands," she observed. "My father taught. Before reservation." Dakota wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool air. "He built things for settlers sometimes. When peace." It was more than he had spoken at once since she'd met him, and Emma sensed an opportunity to learn more about this mysterious man who had entered her life so unexpectedly. "You don't live on the reservation?" she asked carefully, unsure if the question might offend him. Dakota's expression darkened slightly. "No, not anymore." He looked toward the distant horizon. "Not with whites. Not with tribe. Alone better." Emma nodded, understanding the sentiment all too well. "That's what I thought too after James died. Being alone meant not having to explain myself to anyone." She paused, realizing how much she'd missed simple conversation. "Do you ever get tired of the silence?" Dakota considered her question with the seriousness he seemed to give to everything. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but dangerous to trust." "Yet you helped me during the storm," Emma pointed out. "You could have just watched me freeze." "Different," he said simply. Emma wanted to ask how it was different, but Dakota had already moved on, gathering his few tools. "Done now. We'll hold against snow." "Come inside," Emma said, gesturing toward the cabin. "I promised you a meal, and I keep my promises." Inside the small cabin, Emma busied herself preparing a simple stew with the remains of a rabbit Dakota had left days earlier and some preserved vegetables from her root cellar. He sat awkwardly at her table, looking out of place among her few feminine touches, the quilt her mother had made, the pressed flowers in a frame on the wall. "Where do you stay?" Emma asked as she worked. "During the storms, I mean." "Caves, sometimes abandoned cabins." He ran a hand along the edge of her table, appreciating the craftsmanship. "Move often. Safer." "Safer from whom?" The question slipped out before Emma could consider its wisdom. Dakota's expression closed off momentarily, then he sighed. "Army hunts Comanche who leave reservation. Settlers shoot Indians on sight. Tribe punishes those who live like whites." His mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Everyone." Emma stirred the stew, absorbing his words. She had never considered how precarious life must be for someone caught between worlds as Dakota was. Her isolation was by choice. His was by necessity. "You're welcome to sleep in the barn when the weather's bad," she offered impulsively. "It's not much, but it's warmer than a cave." Dakota studied her face, clearly trying to understand her motives. "Why help?" Emma considered her answer carefully. "You helped me when I needed it most. And maybe I'm tired of silence too." Something shifted in Dakota's expression, a subtle softening around the eyes that transformed his entire face. He didn't smile, not quite, but the permanent tension in his features eased slightly. "Stew smells good," he said, changing the subject. They ate in companionable silence, the barriers between them not gone, but somehow less imposing. When they finished, Dakota helped her clean the few dishes, handling her mother's old china with surprising gentleness. "I should go." he said finally, looking out the window at the lengthening shadows. "We'll check fence tomorrow." "Saw broken posts west side." Emma walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to return to her solitary existence. "Thank you for fixing the coop. And for the food you've been leaving." Takoda nodded, adjusting the rifle slung across his back. At the threshold, he paused. "Be careful. Saw tracks yesterday, not animal." Emma's momentary contentment evaporated. "What kind of tracks?" "Men. 3, maybe 4. Not far." His expression grew serious. "Keep axe close." With that warning, he slipped away into the gathering dusk, leaving Emma staring after him with renewed anxiety. She barred her door that night for the first time in months and kept the loaded shotgun James had taught her to use propped against her bedside. Sleep eluded her as she strained to hear any unusual sounds above the normal creaks and groans of the cabin settling. When she finally drifted off near dawn, her dreams were troubled. Faceless men approaching through the snow, while a silent figure watched helplessly from the distance. March arrived with the first hints of spring, patches of grass emerging from melting snow, and the tentative songs of returning birds. Emma's days fell into a new rhythm that included Takoda's regular presence around her homestead. He never stayed the night, always disappearing into the forest before dusk, but each morning brought evidence of his watchful care: firewood stacked neatly by her door, game hanging from the porch post, tracks circling her property like a protective boundary. They spoke more freely now, sharing fragments of their lives during the midday meals Emma insisted upon whenever he worked on her land. She learned that Takoda had been educated briefly at a missionary school before running away to rejoin his people, which explained his understanding of English. He, in turn, listened attentively to her stories of life in Tennessee before she and James had journeyed west with dreams of their own land. Emma knew what the arrangement would look like to outsiders, a widow and a Comanche, working side by side as if the bloody history between their peoples didn't exist. But out here, far from judgmental eyes, such distinctions seemed increasingly meaningless compared to the practical reality of survival. On this particular morning, Emma was hanging laundry, while Takoda repaired the fence along the western edge of her property. The simple domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. How normal it had become to have him nearby, how much she had come to rely on his quiet strength. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful moment. Emma froze, a damp shirt clutched in her hands, as 3 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking her homestead. Even at a distance, she recognized the center figure, Henry Blackwood, owner of the largest cattle operation in the county and the man who had been trying to buy her land since James's death. "Get inside." Takoda's voice came from directly behind her, making her jump. He had materialized from the tree line the moment the riders appeared. "I can't just inside," he repeated more firmly. "I will go." He was already backing toward the forest, clearly intending to disappear before the riders came close enough to spot him. "No," Emma said, making a sudden decision. She grabbed his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Stay. This is my land. I decide who's welcome on it." Takoda's dark eyes searched her face. "Dangerous," he warned. "So is facing them alone," she countered. After a moment's hesitation, Takoda gave a curt nod. "Behind cabin," he conceded. "Close enough to hear, not seen." It was a compromise Emma could accept. She watched him slip around the back of the cabin before turning to face the approaching riders, squaring her shoulders as they drew near. Henry Blackwood pulled his horse to a stop a few yards from where Emma stood, his imposing figure casting a long shadow in the morning light. Flanking him were 2 of his ranch hands, both armed with rifles, resting casually across their saddles. "Mrs. Caldwell," Blackwood called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that mimicked politeness without containing any actual respect. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Mr. Blackwood," Emma acknowledged stiffly. "Winter weather makes travel difficult." Blackwood dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men before approaching on foot. At 53, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. His cattle empire stretched across 3 counties, and most local businesses depended on his goodwill to survive. "I notice you've made some improvements to the place," he commented, glancing toward the repaired chicken coop and new fence posts. "Quite impressive for a woman alone." Emma felt her cheeks warm but kept her expression neutral. "Did you ride all this way to discuss my carpentry skills, Mr. Blackwood?" A hint of amusement crossed his face. "Direct as always, Mrs. Caldwell." No, I came with a proposition. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. I'm prepared to offer you $1,500 for this property. That's $300 more than my last offer, and considerably more than you'd get from anyone else. Emma didn't reach for the paper. My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Blackwood. This land is not for sale. Blackwood's smile tightened. You should consider your position carefully, Mrs. Caldwell. A woman alone has few friends on the frontier. Anything could happen. Illness, accident, Indian trouble. He emphasized the last words. Who would know if you needed help? The thinly veiled threat hung in the air between them. Emma felt a cold knot form in her stomach, but refused to show fear. Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood? Merely stating facts, he replied smoothly. This land would make a fine addition to the Diamond B. The creek access alone is worth my offer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Be sensible, Emma. Take the money. Start fresh somewhere more suitable for a woman of your background. My husband and I came west for this land, Emma said firmly. I buried him on that hill over there. I won't dishonor his memory by selling to a man who only sees its value in dollars. Blackwood's facade of civility slipped, his expression hardening. Sentiment is a luxury, Mrs. Caldwell, one I suspect you can ill afford. His gaze swept over her modest homestead. I've heard rumors of a Comanche seen near these parts, probably one of those reservation jumpers. They're unpredictable, dangerous. Sheriff Tucker is organizing a patrol to track him down. Emma's heart raced, but she kept her face impassive. I haven't seen any Indians, Mr. Blackwood, but I thank you for the warning. Blackwood studied her face, clearly not believing her. Interesting. My men found Comanche tracks circling this property just yesterday. He gestured toward one of his ranch hands. Brady here used to scout for the army, says the tracks are fresh. Regular too, like someone patrolling. Emma's mouth went dry, but she lifted her chin defiantly. Perhaps your man's tracking skills aren't what they used to be. The ranch hand named Brady spat tobacco juice onto the ground. I know Indian sign when I see it, Mum. Been following it half my life. Blackwood stepped even closer, close enough that Emma could smell tobacco on his breath. I wonder what Sheriff Tucker would make of that. Harboring a hostile Indian is a serious matter. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Blackwood? Emma asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Not yet, he replied, his eyes cold. But my offer won't remain open indefinitely. Spring roundup starts next week. I'll expect your answer by then. He handed her the folded document. Read it over. Be smart, Mrs. Caldwell. Emma took the paper without looking at it. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. With a final assessing look, Blackwood returned to his horse and mounted. 1 week, he reminded her, then turned his horse toward the ridge, his men falling in behind him. Emma stood motionless until the riders disappeared from view, then released a shaky breath. She crumpled the document in her fist, anger replacing fear. You heard? She asked, not turning around. Yes. Takoda stepped from behind the cabin, his expression grim. He wants land badly. He's wanted it since before James died, Emma explained bitterly. The creek makes it valuable for his cattle. Summer water rights in this county are worth more than gold. Takoda's eyes followed the distant dust from the riders. Man like that. Dangerous enemy. I know. Emma sank onto the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. But I can't sell. I just can't. Takoda sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. Why? He asked simply. Emma stared at the rolling hills that had become her home. James died believing we could build something here, something that would last. Selling to Blackwood would be like, she struggled to find the words, like admitting defeat, like saying James died for nothing. Takoda nodded slowly, understanding etched in his features. My people fought for land too. Different reasons, same feeling. He touched the earth beside the porch. Ground holds memory, holds ancestors, not just property. Exactly. Emma looked at him gratefully, struck by how completely he understood what she had struggled to explain to the townspeople for years. They sat in silence for a moment before Takoda spoke again. Should leave. My presence brings danger to you. No, Emma said firmly. Blackwood would still want my land whether you were here or not, at least with you nearby. She hesitated, then finished honestly. I feel safer. Something shifted in Takoda's expression, surprise followed by a warmth that transformed his features. For the first time since she'd known him, he smiled, a slight curve of his lips that nonetheless reached his eyes. Then I stay, he said simply. But careful. No tracks. Emma found herself returning his smile. No tracks, she agreed. Over the next few days, Emma and Dakota prepared for whatever Blackwood might do. They worked together to reinforce the cabin's windows and doors, and Dakota showed her hiding places on her property where she could conceal herself if necessary. He brought his few possessions from the cave where he'd been staying and established a new camp in a densely wooded area at the far edge of her land, close enough to reach quickly, but far enough to avoid detection. Each night, Emma barred her door and tried to sleep, knowing Dakota was somewhere in the darkness watching over her homestead. Each morning, she found some small sign that he had circled the property during the night: a repaired hinge, freshly split wood, tracks carefully brushed away. As Blackwood's deadline approached, Emma's anxiety grew. She knew the cattle baron was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully, especially from a woman he considered beneath him socially. His influence extended to every corner of the county. The sheriff, the banker, even the preacher, all depended on his goodwill. On the 6th day, Dakota returned from hunting with news that made Emma's blood run cold. "Riders," he reported, his expression grave. 8, maybe 10, camped 3 miles east. Blackwood's men. Emma's hands trembled as she set down the coffee pot she'd been holding. "Are you sure?" Dakota nodded. "Heard them talk. Plan to come at dawn." He hesitated, then added, "Not legal business, no sheriff." The implication was clear. Whatever Blackwood had planned, he didn't want official witnesses. Emma sat heavily in her chair, fear washing over her. "What can we do against so many?" Dakota's expression hardened with resolve. "Fight or run." "I won't run," Emma said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it." Dakota studied her face, then nodded once. "Then we prepare." Through the night, they worked side by side, transforming the modest homestead into a defensible position. Dakota showed Emma how to create firing positions that offered protection while maintaining visibility. They filled every available container with water in case the attackers tried to smoke them out. Emma sorted through her meager ammunition, grateful that James had taught her to shoot. As they worked, an unspoken understanding grew between them. Whatever morning brought, they would face it together. Dawn broke with the subtle shifting of darkness to pale grey light. Emma stood at her window, shotgun ready, scanning the tree line for movement. Dakota had disappeared an hour earlier, melting into the pre-dawn shadows with his rifle and a promise to return. The first rays of sunlight had just crested the eastern ridge when Emma spotted them. Riders emerging from the trees, approaching slowly in a wide formation that would surround her cabin. She counted 8 men, all armed, with Blackwood himself leading the center column. Emma's hands tightened on her shotgun. She had positioned herself as Dakota had instructed, with clear sight lines but sufficient cover. Still, the odds were overwhelming, 2 against 8, and one of those 2 a woman with limited shooting experience. Blackwood halted his men about 50 yards from the cabin. "Mrs. Caldwell," he called out, "I've come for your answer." Emma didn't respond, watching as the men spread out further, encircling her property. "I know you're in there, Emma," Blackwood shouted again. "Let's discuss this civilly. No need for unpleasantness." Like clockwork, the first shot rang out, but not from the cabin. From somewhere to the west, a rifle cracked, and one of Blackwood's men cried out, clutching his shoulder as he tumbled from his horse. Confusion erupted among the riders. Another shot came from the east, taking down a second man with a wound to the leg. Dakota was moving, shooting from different positions to create the illusion of multiple defenders. Emma seized the moment, throwing open her window and firing a warning shot above the riders' heads. "Leave my property, Blackwood," she shouted. "Next shot won't be a warning." Blackwood's face contorted with rage. "Damn you, woman! You're harboring that Indian savage." He turned to his remaining men. "Burn her out! Set fire to the cabin!" 2 riders broke from the group, racing toward the cabin with torches already lit. Emma took careful aim and fired, the shotgun blast kicking hard against her shoulder. One rider veered off as buckshot peppered the ground near his horse's hooves. The second continued his charge. From somewhere in the trees, Dakota's rifle cracked again. The charging rider jerked in his saddle, dropping his torch as he struggled to stay mounted. His horse, panicked by the gunfire, reared and threw him to the ground. "You're outnumbered, Blackwood," Emma called out, quickly reloading the shotgun. "How many men are you willing to lose today?" Blackwood's response was to draw his own pistol and fire at the cabin, the bullet splintering wood near the window. Emma ducked as more shots followed, peppering the cabin walls. The exchange of gunfire continued for what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes. Dakota moved like a ghost through the trees, firing from different positions, creating the impression of multiple defenders. Emma held her position at the window, firing only when she had a clear shot, making each bullet count as James had taught her. 3 of Blackwood's men were down now, wounded but not killed. The others had taken cover behind rocks and trees, their confidence clearly shaken by the unexpected resistance. "Enough!" Blackwood finally shouted, his voice hoarse with fury. "Hold your fire." The sudden silence was almost as startling as the gunfire had been. Emma remained in position, shotgun ready, as Blackwood slowly stood from behind a boulder where he'd taken cover. "This isn't over, Emma Caldwell," he called out. "No piece of land is worth dying for." "I agree," Emma replied steadily. "So take your men and ride out while you still can." Blackwood's face twisted with impotent rage. "You think you've won. The law in this county will hear about your Indian friend. Harboring a hostile is a hanging offense. And attempted murder isn't," Emma countered. "How do you think Sheriff Tucker will react when he learns the great Henry Blackwood led an armed assault on a widow's homestead?" Uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face for the first time. Emma pressed her advantage. "I've kept a journal, Mr. Blackwood. Every threat, every visit, all documented and left with a trusted friend in Thornfield. If anything happens to me, that journal goes to the territorial governor." The lie came easily, born of desperation and a sudden flash of inspiration. Blackwood stared at the cabin for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gestured to his remaining men. "Get the wounded. We're pulling back." Emma watched, hardly daring to breathe as Blackwood's men helped their injured comrades onto horses. Within minutes they had retreated beyond the ridge, leaving only churned earth and spent bullet casings as evidence of the confrontation. When the last rider disappeared from view, Emma's legs finally gave out. She slid down the wall beneath the window, shotgun still clutched in trembling hands, as the full impact of what had just occurred washed over her. She wasn't sure how much time passed before a soft knock at the door jolted her back to awareness. "Emma?" Dakota's voice came through the wooden barrier. "They gone? Safe now." She scrambled to her feet and unbarred the door. Dakota stood on her porch, his rifle slung across his back. A small cut on his cheek, the only indication he'd been in danger at all. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes quickly scanning her for injuries. Emma shook her head, suddenly unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. Dakota stiffened momentarily, clearly startled by the embrace, then hesitantly placed his hands on her shoulders. "We alive," he said softly. "That good?" A sound that was half laugh, half sob escaped Emma's throat. "Yes," she agreed, stepping back and wiping her eyes. "That's very good." In the days that followed, Emma and Dakota remained vigilant, but Blackwood and his men did not return. News reached them through a sympathetic trader that 3 of Blackwood's ranch hands had required a doctor's care for gunshot wounds, explained away as a hunting accident. The story had raised eyebrows, but no one in town dared question Blackwood directly. Spring advanced rapidly, transforming the landscape. Emma's small garden began to sprout, and new calves were born to the few cattle she kept. With each passing day without incident, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps Blackwood had decided her land wasn't worth the cost after all. Dakota continued to sleep in his camp at the edge of her property, but spent his days working alongside her. The rhythm of their shared labor created a companionship that transcended words, a partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection that neither acknowledged openly. One evening in late April, as they sat on Emma's porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Dakota broke their comfortable silence.